Good afternoon to all. My name is Dr. Danielle LaRocca, President of the Women in Medicine Legacy Foundation, and I would like to welcome everyone to the Women in Medicine Legacy Foundation's presentation of the 2024 Alma Dea Morani Renaissance Women Award. I want to thank Dr. Eileen Fenoy for her leadership as chair of the selection committee of the ADM and the entire board of directors. During the entirety of the event, and especially during the Q&A, if you have any questions or comments, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Please enable captions as needed. The support staff and I will present questions to our awardee, but be aware that given time constraints, your questions might not be answered. The event is being recorded and will be posted online in the coming days. And now, please join me in welcoming our co-host, the New York Academy of Medicine President, Dr. Ann Kurth.
Thank you, Dr. LaRocca. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Ann Kurth, President of the New York Academy of Medicine. On behalf of NIAM and the Women in Medicine Legacy Foundation, welcome to the 2024 Alma Dea Morani Award presentation. We're delighted to continue our outstanding partnership with the Women in Medicine Legacy Foundation and for NIAM to be the home for this very special event. It's exciting to partner with another like-minded organization that also recognizes and celebrates the valuable contributions of women in medicine and our role towards building health equity. Throughout our 177-year history, NIAM has been and continues to be a leading voice for innovation in population health. In a world where there are increasing disparities, compounded by the pressures of climate change, our work is needed now more than ever to innovate for the health of New York City, the nation, and the planet. Today, NIAM's work addresses challenges to health across the health span, from birth justice and safe birth to aging well. By focusing on disparities and advancing health equity along the life journey, we're enhancing the quality of life lived and a longer health span for everyone. We do this by utilizing NIAM's expert researchers, clinicians, policy and health advocates, and leverage our role as conveners to find new ways to address the increasing challenges to health for all. That's exactly what is happening here today as we recognize individual excellence, as well as celebrating and building upon the historical contributions of generations of women in medicine. Today, we are recognizing an exceptionally accomplished woman, Dr. Myrna Weissman. Over the course of her innovative career, Dr. Weissman developed the first epidemiologic study of rates of clinically based psychiatric disorders in the US, work that became a model and is now widely used outside of the US, transforming her field and our understanding of mental health disorders. From the commendations you will hear today, it will be crystal clear why she is being presented with the Alma Dea Morani Award. Once again, thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to now welcome back Dr. Danielle LaRocca, who is a senior research scientist at NIAM and president of the Women in Medicine Legacy Foundation. It was through her foresight that our two organizations came together for this collaboration, so thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, Dr. Kurth, and thank you to the New York Academy of Medicine for partnering with us, not only for this presentation of the Alma Dea Morani Renaissance Women Award, but for all the cooperative programs between the Foundation and NIAM that promote the history of women in medicine now and in the future. This partnership in its sixth year has already been tremendously synergistic with the mission of our foundation, and we are so thrilled to be working with the Academy. The Women in Medicine Legacy Foundation was founded with a strong belief that understanding our history plays a powerful role in shaping our future. The resolute stand women took to establish their place in medical fields propels our vision forward. We serve as stewards to the stories from the past and take pride in sharing them with the women of today. We fully recognize and celebrate the immense talents, diversity, and complex identities of the women in the United States, North America, and globally. For more than 25 years, the Foundation has made significant accomplishments in promoting and advancing the history of women in medicine and the medical sciences through our annual Renaissance Women Award, research fellowships, oral history collection, processing grants, and scholarship program. Recently, we completed a pilot initiative called the Hub, which begins to catalog and electronically display biographical and professional materials from a diverse array of illustrious women in medicine, making their legacies visible and discoverable. The Hub draws from the discipline of history to engage researchers, educators, and medical community in conversation, learning, reflection, and knowledge production related to the experiences of women in medicine, science, and of course, public health. We will continue to expand on the Hub in 2025 with the addition of 3 new profiles of exceptional women in the sciences. We need your support. None of this would be possible without the support of private donations from those of you who share our passion for preserving and promoting the history of women in the medical sciences and the impact on health in the future. Your gifts help support our programs and in a significant way enable us to promote our mission throughout the continent. I encourage you to become a member of the 1849 Society and join us in our efforts to advance the role of women in science and medicine today. Thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to Sage Therapeutics, Biogen, and my husband and I are happy to join in this important effort. And finally, the creation of the Alma Dea Morani Renaissance Women Award to honor an outstanding contemporary woman physician or scientist in North America who has had a significant impact on our knowledge and understanding of medicine, medical science, while also contributing importantly to humanitarian causes, social sciences, or the arts. Recipients demonstrate professional excellence, a thirst for knowledge, and service beyond their medical practice or scientific endeavors. It was named for Dr. Alma Dea Morani, the first woman admitted to the American Society of Plastic and Reconstructive Surgeons, and an advocate for humanism in medicine. The Dr. Alma Dea Morani was drawn to medicine by the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. Graduating in 1931, her love of art drew her to plastic surgery, and she set the standard for the Renaissance woman. Her father, Salvatore Morani, was a famous sculptor, and during his lifetime, he cast the hands of famous surgeons. Among this collection was the cast of a famous woman hand surgeon, his daughter, Alma. So most appropriately, the Renaissance Award is a copy of the hand, as you see here, of Alma Dea Morani, the namesake of this honor and one who epitomizes the meaning of the award, created by another Renaissance woman, artist-physician, Dr. Wilma Birkin-Siegel. Thank you, Dr. Siegel. And Dr. Siegel points out that the hand is because surgeons consider the caring as part of their identity, and as should we. To officially introduce our esteemed awardee, I would like to introduce Dean Linda Fried, the 2019 Alma Dea Morani Award recipient. Dr. Linda Fried is Dean of Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. She additionally serves as the Senior Vice President of Columbia University Irvine Medical Center and Director of the Robert Butler Columbia Aging Center, a university-wide center housed in the Mailman School. Dean Fried leads one of the 3 original schools of public health in the U.S. Extraordinary, having just marked its centennial. Most recently, she was named by France as Chevalier of the Legion of Honor in 2023 and received the 2023 Royal Medal of the National Academy of Medicine. Dean Fried, thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon, and Dr. LaRoccarina, thank you for that wonderful introduction and that very generous introduction of myself. It was my great honor to receive this award, and today my particular honor to introduce our 2024 Alma Dea Morani awardee. One of the pleasures of being an awardee of this wonderful organization is the opportunity to interact with others. People we've known for years as women leaders at a distance, we get to meet together for the first time. And all of these women have and all of you have made extraordinary contributions in the medical and health sciences. So today it is my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Myrna M. Weissman. Myrna Weissman is the Diane Goldman Kemper Family Professor of Epidemiology and Psychiatry at the Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons at Columbia University. She is also the chief of the Division of Translational Epidemiology at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Over the course of her innovative career, Dr. Weissman developed the first epidemiologic study of rates of clinically diagnosed psychiatric disorders in the United States. Her work became a model and is now widely used outside of the US. Her research on understanding the risks and rates of mood and anxiety disorders have used methods of epidemiology, genetics, and neuroimaging, and applied these findings to create and test empirically based treatments and preventive interventions. Through this work, she has transformed her field and our understanding of mental health disorders. She also developed interpersonal psychotherapy, otherwise known as IPT, which is the first evidence-based treatment for depression, in collaboration with her late husband, Gerald Clearman. IPT is based on the idea that regardless of the cause of depression, its onset is usually associated with life problems, grief, interpersonal disputes, transitions or loneliness, and absence of meaningful relationships. The understanding of these problems and efforts for solutions is the work of IPT, which has been tested in over 160 clinical trials. IPT has been reported in a 2024 book, which now explores and describes the use of IPT in 31 countries, and IPT itself has been translated into numerous languages and is used worldwide. The book is open access, free of charge. Dr. Weissman has been a consultant to many private and public agencies and is a member of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. She is the author or co-author of over 800 scientific articles and chapters, as well as 11 books. Her current interest is in bringing psychiatric epidemiology closer to translational studies in the neurosciences and genetics, and on using electronic health records for research. She directs a 3-generation study of families at high and low risk for depression who have been studied clinically for nearly 40 years and who have participated in both genetic and imaging studies. She also has directed a multi-center study to determine the impact of maternal remission from depression on the offspring. For these and so many other reasons, we honor Myrna Weissman here today. And Dr. Weissman, I am delighted to present to you the 2024 Alma Dea Morani Award and to present to the audience the awardee, Dr. Myrna Weissman.
Thank you so much. I can't tell you how excited I have been to receive this award, and also for the people who have been associated with the award and the foundation. It's been a great experience in the last month or so. I was asked to talk about my career, and I will do that for a bit at the beginning because some of it will be very familiar to women, even right now. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about sort of a summary of what I have been doing has been somewhat described. So let me begin. This is a wonderful award to receive at the twilight of one's career. It's an opportunity to reflect on the unlikeliness of its happening. And what a luxury to be asked to present not only my research, but also the personal tale of how I got here. What an honor to receive this award on behalf of women. This research I present will be genderless. I think there's a term like that. But the journey to get there is about gender. So let me begin with my personal journey, and then I'll give you a summary of where the research has led. I was groomed to be a wife in my 20s, the earlier the better, and a mother. And soon after, I married and received a social work degree in the passing all tasks of my early 20s as had been degreed. Well, so what's next? The social work degree was an accident. Well, a gentleman and I were the only ones to graduate with honors in our major. And let's assume he was first and I was second for the purpose of modesty, although there was no supporting data. He was encouraged to go to medical school and I was encouraged to get married and perhaps dabble a bit in teaching or be a social worker, but dabble in it. Since I didn't want to teach little children, I said social work, not sure what it was, and I attended University of Pennsylvania. Over the next 7 years, as I graduated, got married, had 4 wonderful babies, I got a social work position at NIH, where I heard about very exciting research as I attended the clinical rounds as the social worker. Next, we all moved to Yale, and I took a job there 2 days a week because I needed some relaxation, some rest time taking care of my children. It was an exciting research job. It was the first maintenance treatment trial of medication to prevent relapse in major depression. But the study needed to include psychotherapy, as the hypothesis was that psychotherapy, as commonly used, would interfere with the medication effects. In other words, if you got the combination, you would do worse. Since I was the social worker on the team, I was asked to help design the psychotherapy. That was a challenge. There were no psychotherapy manuals to describe what you did, and there were no clinical trials. In other words, I was the perfect person because I had no prejudices. Since I love this research, and I was at Yale, and I did this work, and I'll describe a little bit about it, I wanted to spend my career in working on other problems after I finished the clinical trial. I started graduate school again, but this time for a PhD in public health in 1971. And in 1974, I received a PhD in epidemiology from Yale University School of Medicine. So now I had a legitimate academic degree for research, and I had children ages 14, 13, 11, and 8. And I moved from a faculty social worker position to an epidemiology position, all at Yale, rising to professor. I learned to juggle parent meetings, play dates, school holidays, sniffled noses while living close to work. And in 1987, with children all in graduate or medical school, we moved to Columbia University to continue this exciting work. Next slide. My research is in 3 broad areas with meandering for curiosity along the way. There's no time to present all this meandering, so I'm going to just briefly summarize these 3 areas. I will present highlights of the areas with the following caveats. The findings I present will seem simple, obvious, and well-known. When I began in all these areas, the conventional wisdom for evaluating psychotherapy was that you couldn't measure it or evaluate it. Every situation was unique. For doing epidemiologic surveys of psychiatric disorders of people in the community, I was told people wouldn't tell you about their disorders. And for studying familial depression in children, we were told the children do not get depressed because they had insufficient ego development. Well, these ideas seem silly right now, while my research may seem obvious to you. In the 1970s and 80s, when I started, it was not obvious, and instead it was considered undoable. It's hard to believe that, isn't it? Next slide. I'll begin by summarizing the evidence-based psychotherapy studies. This is where the studies began. This was Yale University, and this was our small group. It was a time of great social and political upheaval in New Haven and other parts of the world, and this was our building. The work was considered so unimportant, even though the head of it, Jerry Claremont, was head of the mental health center, that we weren't given space for it because nobody felt you could really be doing evaluation of psychotherapy using manuals. So we were given rental space, which was about 2 blocks from Yale. Next slide. This was the background for treatment. Medications were widely used. Rating scales were developed to test new drugs, but most patients received outpatient care, were not hospitalized, but new laws required that medication have proof of efficacy. That was what started doing clinical trials of psychotherapy, because if you had to add it to the medication where medication was required, then you had to be able to do a clinical trial. The psychotherapy reality was, in practice, it was the most common treatment, not medication. And the conventional wisdom, you couldn't test psychotherapy. And in fact, I think based on 7,000 case studies of psychoanalysis or psychotherapy, concluded that there was no evidence for efficacy. This is how we began. The innovators were Aaron Beck, people who know cognitive therapy, know Aaron Beck. He was a real leader, and he started with trying to manualize cognitive therapy, and Jerry Clairman in New Haven, and they transformed the research and practice of psychotherapy. They worked together, they talked together, but Jerry felt that cognitive therapy was not what would be used in regular psychiatric practice, so developed interpersonal. Beck was influenced by the cognitive psychologist, Clairman by running the first multi-centered clinical trial of medication. Over 40 years ago, they began writing scripts independently, but as friends, for what became CBT and IBT. John Rush and I joined as their assistants. Next slide. I think you've heard a little bit about IPT is from Linda. It assumes that there's a relationship between the disruptions of close attachments through death of a loved one, disagreements, life changes, loneliness, isolation, and the onset of recurrence of symptoms such as distress or depression, and that these triggers are conserved across cultures. It does not get into the biological causes of depression, but says that when a person becomes depressed or has an exacerbation of symptoms, there's something going on in their interpersonal life. IPT set out to categorize or simplify what these problem areas are: grief, which was complicated bereavement, role disputes with conflicts with significant others, role transitions, change in life, divorce, interpersonal deficits, loneliness, and isolation. What is amazing to me, in the 31 countries that have given us reports, these problem areas are ones that are used in countries like Senegal and Mozambique, as well as France and Germany. Next slide. Now, after the first clinical trial was done, and it didn't come out as expected, it came out showing that psychotherapy affected social functioning, whereas medication helped reduce the symptoms, and that together both treatments were more effective than either one alone. That was the beginning of needing to do a real strong additional clinical trial. And the government put a great deal of money into having a collaborative 3-year study of depression. This was not met with a great deal of enthusiasm, and these were some of the headlines in the Science Time. Psychiatry, First Guide to Therapy is fiercely opposed, and from the Department of Health, that was showing where it began, and they said, the federal government is putting psychotherapy on the couch. This was 1980. Next slide, please. I won't go into all the details. There are, as Linda said, over 160 clinical trials, and we've identified its use in 31 countries and have put together. The pandemic gave me a great deal of time to collect information from all these countries, and that was my work of the 3 years. And we have now documented what countries say about it, what works, what doesn't work. However, in Nature in 2012, to show how far the field has come, this was from an editorial saying that Studies to enhance psychological treatments are scandalously undersupported. And as you can read in this editorial, it was very supportive of having manualized evidence-based psychotherapy. And these are psychotherapies that have been subjected to clinical trials. Next slide. So as I've said, there's over 160 efficacy studies, and there's global use. And this is one of the reviews of the clinical trials published in 2021 by a group other than our own. And it was talked about efficacy, acceptability, and long-term outcome. Next slide. And this was our work of the pandemic. We started to hear about all these studies in the different countries, and we're very interested in how a common thread would work in countries that seem to have such different social structure. And having a lot of time on our hands because we couldn't go anyplace during the pandemic, I collaborated with one of our very brilliant junior faculty, Jennifer Mose, and we put together a letter and rules for getting information and chapters from these different countries. And we've produced an over 500-page book which describes this, and it's open access if you want it. All you do is you can download it. You can buy a book too, but you can download it. It's the same book. And this was the underlying idea, is that human attachments are critical to well-being in every country. In every country, there's severance through death, disputes, life changes, or their absence is associated with distress. This simple truth holds across different cultures and situations and is a reflection of our common humanity. IPT is just one method in an evidence-based toolbox to repair these human fractures. Next slide. So we reached out, as I told you, we had lots of time on our hands, and we got chapters that describe, and we were told, we want to know if you use IPT, what you have changed, what works and what doesn't work, and we want honest answers. And we did, we got chapters from all of these countries, including Iran, Israel, and Lebanon. A little side story, we had a chapter for Russia, and the people in Ukraine were very upset about that. So we're going to publish that separately. We had no choice about that, but there were very strong feelings about Ukraine, from Ukraine about Russia. And the Russians understood, since many of them had relatives in Ukraine. So this is available to anyone who wants it. If you send me or you send Oxford Press an email, they'll send you the link. Next slide. So let's talk about epidemiology. And the idea is you can't make diagnoses in a community. People won't answer that question. Well, we know that that's silly now. Next slide. Well, the first thing we did was to sneak in a little pilot study in which we used regular psychiatric disorders that had been defined. And we did it in a probability sample of about 500 people in a study that was going on anyway out of Yale in New Haven, Connecticut. And we showed in that study that you could make diagnoses in the community. We didn't understand why you couldn't, because people have been asking about sexual behavior for a number of years before. But we showed in that with those 511 subjects that people would answer those questions. Based on that, we were finally able to get funding to carry out the first large-scale community-based survey to determine rates and risks of psychiatric disorders within the community, called the ECA, the Epidemiologic Catchment Area Study. Now, I'm a little uncomfortable. I don't feel that I can't take credit for this whole thing. I take credit for the fact we did the pilot study and that was used to write this huge grant, which involved 5 centers in the United States and many different principal investigators who were quite competent and wonderful to work with. We did ours in New Haven, Connecticut. This study was unique because diagnostic criteria used in clinical research and practice were used in the community survey. Why people thought you couldn't is still beyond me, but that was the conventional wisdom. And we showed that you could, and it's widely accepted now. Next slide. This was just to show you the results of this and some of the people who worked on it. It was a book edited by Lee Robbins, who was a brilliant woman from St. Louis. Unfortunately, he's deceased now, but she really led the field before us. And it's all published in a book called Psychiatric Disorders in America. And it has the data from the 5 sites: New Haven, Connecticut, Baltimore, Maryland, St. Louis, Missouri, Durham, North Carolina, and Los Angeles, California, the 5 sites. And this shows affective disorders. For some reason, New Haven, Connecticut had the highest rates. We're not quite sure why that is, but we do talk about it in the book. Now, we were very, very proud of this work. Much better work has gone on now. The samples are larger, and also the probability samples of the whole United States, not just 5 sites in the United States. But it was the beginning, and it's also been carried on all over the world. Next slide. So these are some of the studies that have been going on. When you read in the newspaper that 12% of people living in a community have schizophrenia or affective disorders, it usually comes from one of these surveys. And between the 1990s to the 2000s, there was a national comorbidity survey. There was a cross-national study of 10 countries. There was a collaborative study that focused on Latinos, Blacks, and Asian Americans. Since they're a smaller representation of the population, there needed to be surveys that just focused on these groups, so there were larger samples. And then there's what's called the NESARC. A lot of this work was led by Ron Kessler, who was at Harvard, and really took over and became the world master in these types of epidemiologic surveys. I wanted to do other things, and I was glad to see the work carried out by others. The next slide. Well, this is how I've spent a lot of my time over the last 20 years. It's not the only thing, but it's really had my heart. With studying familial transmission of depression, studying the offspring and the grandchildren of depressed people. And in fact, we even have 100 great-grandchildren. We haven't studied them yet. We're waiting for them to get to the age where they can talk to us. And again, the wisdom is that children didn't have sufficient ego development. Well, let me say that now there are some large-term studies going on studying the children under the age of 6 and their rates of mental illness. So there's enough data and convention, and it's well believed that depression can begin very, very early, although oftentimes it begins with an anxiety disorder and merges into depression around the age of 13 to 14. But we know this through these studies. Next slide, please. So this is my high-risk study. It's a high risk because there are people at high risk for depression, not because we're at high risk. And we studied the offspring and the grandchildren of depressed, those are the high risk, and non-depressed families. And this is a standard pedigree. As you can see, generation 1 is the provenance. And then we study all the offspring, and these are the offspring and their spouse, because we follow them as they get married or have partners, but mostly have children. And then we have the 3rd generation. And we have hundreds of family members who have been studied this way. We also have what we call the control group, and that's where the proband begins as never having any mental illness and being what we call a control, maybe we don't say normal control, but just a control. They certainly don't have depression and they don't have other major disorders. We interview every family member using structured diagnostic interviews. We train people on how to do it. It takes several months to be able to bring somebody up to speed. And they're all clinically experienced. And they're also all blind to the original proband diagnosis, so that when they interview an offspring, they don't know whether they're interviewing an offspring of a depressed or a non-depressed proband. We then take all of the information that's done in structured interviews, and we give that to a psychiatrist or psychologist not involved in the original interview, and we make what's called a best estimate diagnosis. We try as much as possible to be neutral and to make sure we get the real findings. Next slide. This study's been going on for a long time, and I'll just show you a glimpse of what it looks like. And here on the left-hand side, you see the green, which are the rates of depression by age. And you can see that around age 7 or 8, the rates start to go up and they peak around adolescence. Now, this is when they have their first onset. And of course, as we've studied these people over time, the onset may be at age 15 to 20, but along the way, as we have followed people over 30, 40 years, they have many of them get better and never are ill, but many of them have recurrent episodes. And you can see the same pattern, the red, among the normals, the relatives of the non-depressed. And it shows the same pattern, but the rates are far lower, much lower. And that's the finding that we have had consistently over the years as we've re-interviewed these people. We've had at least 8 re-interviews of these families. Whenever we have funding, we have a re-interview. And then, of course, we looked at the grandchildren, because how is this transmitted, and are these disorders, do they run consistently in families? And here we've had a very suggestively positive finding, which is the grandparents. And if the grandparents are low risk, the negative, and the parent is low risk, then, and one of the has a high risk, that's the green, you'll see that the rates in the grandchildren are low. In the high-risk families, the rates are higher than in the low risk, but it isn't until you see the doubly affected grandchildren that you have the very high rates. That's a small sample, and that's a group where both the parent and the grandparent had depression. And there, by the age of 18, 40% of the grandchildren had a depression. So that points to where we might do case finding and do early intervention. Of course, we're following up these people, and we will have more information about later onsets. Next slide. Just to summarize what was consistent across 3 generations, there's a 2 to 6-fold increased risk of depression in the high-risk groups. Anxiety is the first presentation in childhood. That's tough because children get anxious, but a child who has a family history of depression and starts to show anxiety when they're before puberty is a child that may be at risk for more problems. Substance abuse is increased in adulthood in everybody, but particularly in the high-risk group. 40% of the grandchildren with a depressed parent and a grandparent have a depression by adolescence. It's the slide I showed you before. The parents now in their 50s, the high-risk parents, have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and we have been showing a much more increased risk of various kinds of medical problems. Now, a lot of these findings are taken for granted, and they're part of the clinical care, but that came from this kind of research. We certainly weren't the only ones doing it, but we did an awful lot of it. Next slide. Well, depression is a complex genetic disorder. Onset and recurrence is precipitated by stress in vulnerable people. If you have a stressful situation and a family history of depression, you're more likely to have an onset of depression. Most of us who don't have family histories don't having stress, but can go get along without getting depressed. A depressed parent is a very stressful event in a vulnerable child. And so we wondered, do children benefit from a remission in their parents' depression? That is, if we can get to a parent who's depressed early, does that help the child not have their onset? So we designed a study to treat the depressed parent and follow their children. Next slide. This was called the STAR-D, where we assessed the children, we followed them over time, and we looked at the child outcome. We didn't know the mother's outcome. That was done separately, and we just interviewed the children. Next slide. And this is what we found. When the depressed parents entered into treatment, a third of their children were currently ill with depression, anxiety, or conduct disorder. There was a very large study going on the treatment of depression, and this was going on throughout the country, and we were able to work with those investigators and see what their findings were, and also identify a sample of people who had children in the right age group that we could follow. Half of their children had a history of these psychiatric disorders. So we started to look at our data to see if the mother remitted from her depression, regardless of how she remitted, what happened to the children. And we just followed the children, not knowing what the mother's clinical status was. And this is what we found after 3 months. If the mother remitted after 3 months, the children got better. That's the first. If the mother did not remit, the children didn't get better. In fact, they were slightly worse. Now there's many papers and all kinds of analysis, and I won't bore you with this. I just wanted to make the point that if a parent is depressed, get them into treatment right away, because it not only helps the parent, but it helps the whole family. Now, we don't know after 1 year. We've only followed them 1 year. It's hard to get funding to follow people for more than that time. And we also didn't look at depressed fathers, because interviewing fathers was difficult. But I would certainly encourage anybody who can do that study to go to it, because it should be done. Next slide. So what do we make of all this? Reducing stress defined as maternal depression in high-risk children by having a parent achieve remission. And we know how to do that. We have very good medications, and we have psychotherapy. But this can help to reduce the child's symptoms. The earlier the mother's remission, the better the child. Even the children of late remitters, in other words, the mother took 6 months to 1 year, even those children improved. And these results were sustained 1 year after remission. Poor single mothers and their children had the lowest rate of remission. Next slide. Now, I've only talked about the clinical, and we are well aware of the fact of the strong need to look at some of the biology, the brain activities, the genes. And this is looking for endophenotypes. And we have a group that are doing MRI studies, EEG studies, DNA. Some of it's our group, and this is being done all over the country by different groups in different ways, but trying to look for in fact, that's where the research is going in this direction, because I think we have mapped out the clinical course of these illnesses. We've mapped them out so well that it's common knowledge and it's used for treatment. But what we don't really know are some of the biological underpinnings, which are very important to know. And that work is going on. And if you gave me a 2.5-hour lecture, I could even begin to talk about it. But this is being done mostly by other people. And I wanted to focus on what we did as history. Next slide. So where are we now? Our current understanding. Psychotherapy, like medication, can be tested in controlled clinical trials, and several now are considered evidence-based psychotherapies. As far as epidemiology, the rates, the age of onset, the risks of psychiatric disorders in community samples are now available worldwide, and not just in developed countries, but now it's becoming in developing countries. We now know that depression is highly familial, and the first onsets are in youth. It isn't a disorder, as we were told, of menopausal women. In fact, around the menopause, the rates of first onset of depression really go down. It is a disorder of youth, and I think that a lot of the research, and probably not enough, but some of the clinical care is being directed to youth. A psychosocial and a biological understanding of transmission is emerging, and the successful treatment of a depressed parent can have a positive effect on their depressed offspring. So it's well worth putting a lot of effort into that treatment, because it's a 2-for or a 3-for or more. Next slide. That concludes much of what I wanted to say. I'm doing other work. We're working on electronic health records and trying to make sense of them, because my samples were large. We have maybe 1,000, and there are even larger samples of 10,000. But when you start looking at electronic health records, you're talking about hundreds of thousands. And we're working strongly on that. It is very difficult work. We have groups of people that are doing very interesting biological work and getting deeper and deeper into that. And the psychotherapy work is expanding into very interesting areas where we've been taking some of the work that's being done in Mozambique and in African countries and in modifying psychotherapy and trying to apply it in the United States, so that psychotherapy will not become, or will no longer, we hope, be something that only the very rich can afford, or if they have really terrific health insurance, which very few people do, but something that can be time limited, can be administered through people who are trained, but don't necessarily have an MD degree or even a PhD, and will be able to help a lot of people in the short run. Now, of course, not everybody who has psychiatric problems can be helped that way, but there are many problems of living which cause great distress to people and can really impair their functioning, if not alleviated quickly. And some of these briefer psychotherapies are being tried out now. They're by telephone, by internet, and by various other ingenious things. The younger generation is very skilled in using the computer to come up with things. Now, this represents just a small number of the people. These are the most recent people that I've worked with. I have quite a number of ones who are doing wonderful work and who are now really the leaders in the field. And it's been a pleasure to be able to do this work. And it's also a pleasure to be able to brag about it. So thank you very much.
Oh, Dr. Weissman, Myrna, I mean, I'm smiling because it is such a pleasure to hear you, to understand your journey, both in terms of your personal journey and your determination to address a critically important problem which has reachable solutions. So I want to thank you for your insights, your extraordinary contributions. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank Dean Freed, because it's an honor to have two amazing Alma Dea Morani Award winners today. And I'll share with the audience that I had the pleasure of spending 3 delightful hours with you this summer, because I thought that as we give this award, as I mentioned, we give it because of your scientific contributions to the field, right? But we also give it because of your humanity and your contribution to us all. And I was able to appreciate that in our visit together and with your husband, Jim Frothall. And it was such a pleasure. When I prepared for this in the question and answer period, I thought I would have a beginning question, but no need, because our audience has had a number of questions, which I will try to collapse some of them. So one of the first questions that came up had to do with whether or not you could comment on gender differences, both in terms of depression onset as well as response. Perhaps, I'm guessing what the questioner was asking, the effectiveness of the interpersonal therapy. Could you comment on that? And there are several other questions that.
Yeah. The rates of depression are higher in women than in men, and that's in all the countries that have been studied. So men may express the same kinds of problems in different ways, but certainly men get depressed. And the age of onset is not, we haven't seen any big differences, but we can't understand why women have more depression than men on a clinical or biological level, but it's a reality.
In response to treatment, any thoughts?
We often end up with not enough men in the trials.
Right.
And to be honest.
Okay.
So I can't say we have a strong finding. There may be somebody around who has a strong finding, and I hope we learn about it, but I haven't seen it. Right. I haven't seen differences either.
The other question that occurred related to some of what you've commented on, and it's incredible that your work went beyond worldwide in very varied cultural settings. But the question was really to expand a little bit on that and how culture, generational views, expression, acceptance of depression from either religious or spiritual educational levels accounts for, I think they're saying your assessment of, I think they're asking about sort of the samples of individuals that you were able to study and the implications for the effectiveness of either interpersonal therapy or generational prevalence of depression.
Well, we're very proud of studying 31 countries. We brag about it, but that's a small number.
So, right. Now there are 190 or so countries, so correct. And many others that we don't recognize.
Yeah, and also these are the ones who had somebody there who could write something about this. So as an epidemiologist, it's a very biased sample. On the other hand, there's great variety. I mean, we had Mozambique, we had Senegal, we had Ethiopia, we had Paris, we had Berlin. What amazed me is that we didn't have great differences in response. We sometimes have differences in implementation. I'll give you one example. In Africa, in Uganda, and I can only talk about Uganda because I haven't heard about this in other countries of Africa. If a woman is angry with her husband, and that comes out in the IPT, the reason she's angry is not usually very different between countries, but she will not go, and nor is she encouraged to go and tell her husband how she feels about it. What she does is she'll talk to an elder in the community, and the elder will talk to the husband, and she'll cook bad food. So that's a little insight into it. It may be just a prejudice one, but it gives you an idea that there's ways of adapting, but doing really the same thing.
Right. I was impressed by reading some of your work, that the adaptability. Could you speak? I think that question was really how you adapted your methods to different cultural groups. And you just gave a wonderful example in terms of how the expression of the woman in Uganda.
Well, let me tell you, I didn't adapt anything to culture groups. I wouldn't even begin to have the gall to do that. What do I know about Uganda? I mean, we've done
Interesting.
studies there, but I don't know. But what we have done, or what has been done, we didn't even do it, is there's a method. We make it available. It's free. You can get it. We used to have it in books, and then you had to buy a book. But now we've been able to get the book online free of charge, so you can read. You don't have to pay for it. And then they adapt it, and then they get somebody who knows something about it and comes and does a workshop to their social workers or their community health workers, and they start using it. And in fact, when we wrote this last book with these 31 countries, a lot of them I had never heard of. I didn't know. When I heard about them, I wrote to them. So it isn't something we do, it's something they do.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. I guess one of the questions that emerges from some of the discussions is, we've been challenged in our own country, in the United States, right, of actually the application of knowledge to change curricula, educational curricula. You've written about that. I guess, could you comment a little bit about sort of the challenges that we face, knowing some of the science and the incredible science you've had, how we begin to translate that in a country that doesn't have health as a human right necessarily, right? And you mentioned that, and mental health is often, access to it is dictated by our financing or lack of healthcare and mental health. Can you sort of say what's next steps for us as a country? I know I laid on a few questions. Go ahead.
I'll tell you a little bit of an experience we've had. That I belong to this group of, and they do genetics and genetic studies all over the world, and they wanted to improve, have countries from all over. We know the genetics of Paris and of Berlin and of New York City, but we don't know anything about many of the African countries or the South American countries. And there are groups now that meet regularly, and they have identified scientists in these groups, and they are working together to implement these studies. And it's amazing. And it's amazing the people you meet and the energy they have and the resources. They don't have a lot of money, but they find a way of doing it. So I'm impressed with what's done. I don't have any magic other than the fact that we make our books available free of charge. I think that's important. And we make our knowledge, for what it's worth, available free of charge. And we have our papers, although it's getting harder to have them free of charge, although we don't charge for them.
Thank you. I know there was one question about whether or not there are specific genes that have been identified. I don't know if you'd like to respond to that, but I think you've responded in terms of the work that your work has stimulated so much and amplified the work of others.
The one thing we know about genes, it isn't the way we thought it was, that it's much more complicated. I had 3 genetic studies. I was going to discover the genetics of depression. And I had them with very talented geneticists. I'm an epidemiologist. And we did our 3 studies, and we don't do them anymore. We've given them to the bank of other studies, and they're put into this giant repository. So they have the genetics of New Haven, Connecticut, and of Stanford University around there. And they're part of a larger group, and now working a lot with people in Africa. Genetics is very complicated. But it's ongoing, and we're going to learn things, not the whole story, but part of it.
Well, thank you. And thank you to the audience, because just to sum up, first of all, thank you, Dr. Weissman, for your incredible contributions. And, there are a couple of things I wanted to cite that you signaled to us. You said refute conventional wisdom. So thank you for refuting conventional wisdom and testing out the hypotheses. some of those conventional wisdoms was children don't get depressed. And as a pediatrician, I really appreciated the fact that you paid attention to the emotional well-being of children. That community work couldn't be done in mental health, and assessments couldn't be done at the community level. You dispelled that myth. And then the rigor in your research, thank you for that, because that's what advanced the field and your continued publication. So we have come to the end of our conversation. So I'd like to thank you for your inspiring remarks. I mean, it's really incredible, and an hour doesn't do this justice, but on behalf of the Women in Medicine Legacy Foundation, I am pleased to have presented to you, as you know, yesterday, and I want to bring the audience attention to the hand that's on. Thank you for pointing that out.
Right there.
It's presented to you with the 2024 Alma Dea Morani Renaissance Woman Award, an honor that is so well deserved. I'd like to also thank Dr. Kurth and the entire team at NIAM, as well as the Women in Medicine Legacy Foundation Board of Directors for their assistance in hosting the year's presentation virtually. And I want to thank all of you who have joined us today in recognizing career and accomplishments of the 2024 awardee, Dr. Myrna Weissman. Such a pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us today. And for the members of the 1849 Society, you should reconnect to the separate Zoom so we can have a small post-event discussion. Thank you all, and be safe.
And thank you. This has been quite an honor to meet all of you and be part of this. I really appreciate this.
Thank you.
Special.